Peace, folks. So glad you're here again. I trust you've been taking care of yourself and being gentle too. Thanks for coming and sharing some time with me. So the last time that we talked, we left with a couple of major questions that I was wrestling with in my life. Those being, how can I be queer and whole? How can I be queer and holy? How can I be whole and holy? There's a massive dissonance, a lot of friction within myself of how I could be fully expressed in my gender, my sexual orientation, and also be this Christian that I'd been raised to be. And so at this point in my life, I guess I'm probably an undergrad, just graduated from high school in undergrad, and I had been in a relationship that pretty much solidified for me that I was definitely queer, but still really struggling with my faith at that time. But I had also reached a critical point in my life by the time that I was about 20, 21 years old. I had become more solidified in just like my identity as a Black person in America, living in a PWI and having that experience. That's a whole nother thing, and that could be another conversation for another day. But all that to say, my tolerance for things that weren't serving me started to actually come to fruition, that I was taking the steps to remove those things or myself from those situations. By that, I mean, from a sexual orientation standpoint, I had already been out to myself, right? And I had decided that if it was going to be Christianity, and if it was going to be the God of Christianity that would have me feel so depressed, so isolated, so alone, so afraid and fearful, then that couldn't be something that I personally could allow myself to engage in the same way that I had been brought up, with the same doctrine that I had been brought up in. Because there was something that was within me, and now looking back, I know that I can actually speak to who that was, being God themselves, my higher self, angels, ancestors, and guides of unconditional love, light, and protection that actually fortified within me and emboldened me to be okay with, at least at that point, stopping engaging with spirituality and religion for the most part, almost completely. Now, I said my prayers. I still had a deep appreciation for spirituality and spirit. Like, I knew and understood there's something much bigger than myself. Hands down. I just knew that. Something shut up in my bones, wouldn't let me let that go. But I knew that the way that church and Christianity that was given to me and that I was consuming, whether it was actual church within the context of the small liberal arts campus that I was on, or having conversations with individuals who are very conservative in the sort, I knew that that form of Christianity was not going to serve me, and so I'd let that go completely. To me, and I continually go back to the scripture because I truly believe it is the most scripture that can be in this book of stories called the Bible. And that scripture is, God is love. And what I saw and what I was experiencing was not love. I knew that, even though like it was a little skewed because of life experiences and stuff, but I knew it didn't feel good. It didn't feel right. I didn't feel like I was at home when I was with Christians. I didn't feel like I could have my defenses down when I was at the church. I didn't feel like I could fully express when I was in that place without feeling as if I was going to be marginalized or even attacked, whether it be like verbally or even physically, depending on where I was. And I knew that I had to just leave that alone. What people have done to the name of God, the personality of God, the character of God, how the scriptures had been distorted. And I had seen, and I was a political scientist, right? So that's basically political science and history, take a nap in the same bed and get out on separate sides. And so I had seen, and I knew how religion and Christianity in particular had been used to oppress and justify so many wrongs and transgressions throughout humanity. And I knew that whatever it was that I was being given, I knew that couldn't be the purest form of God is love. And so I'd let that go, but there was still a deep spirituality that was there, thriving, growing, evolving. I don't know. Actually, let me be honest. It was like just starting to open up. It was just starting to open up. I had at least been to the point where I felt comfortable with saying, I do not agree with the things that I've been taught because they are harmful, they are toxic, and they almost led me to not being here on this earth anymore. I had gotten to the point by undergrad, by 21, 22, that I had opened up to say that even though that might have been a tradition, even though that might have been what was given to me from my ancestors and from my grandparents, my parents, my peers, God, all this, even though everybody was doing that, it didn't necessarily have to be what was true for me or my own spiritual belief system or guiding post. And that is not to say that there aren't amazing and life-affirming aspects of Christianity. I think about this in the way of followers of Christ and not as Christianity that we have seen it in like Western, in the context for me in America. And it's deeply within my roots. And so there are plenty of times that I see the value and the treasures and the gems that Christianity and the way of Christians and the Bible can actually give us that can help us for life. I also feel like Aesop's fables can give us some stuff. I feel like the Quran can give us some stuff. I believe that we can be gifted things from music. I feel like we can be gifted insightfulness with the conversation with a child, with an elder, just being in nature. I feel like there are so many different places and ways that spirit speaks to and connects with us to remind us that we're one with spirit, that I don't feel like there's a need to validate or invalidate another one. I feel like they all have something for us if we choose to. But we'll get into that. So at this critical point, I've graduated college and I'm now at the point where I'm 21 years old. I'm gonna go and teach for a year back in my town because I felt like, for me personally, like, I'm all right, Black folks, if you're gonna get educated, you have to come back to your town and either give time, talent, or treasure. I had time and talent. So I taught for 1 year at the middle school that I actually attended. And as soon as I could get out, I did get out and moved to Washington, D.C. And that was a massive leap from the world that I was in. From, at that time, a small rural town, I would say so. My middle school was like across the street from a cotton field. From a small town to go into Washington, D.C. was a massive change and transition into my world and my life. And it was a massive transition in my consciousness. And I have to pause right now and almost go back in reverse, is because there's an individual that in this time where I had dissonance, in the time where it was difficult to decipher fact from fiction, from what was serving me to what was not, a critical anchor in my life, and still is my oldest brother, Armand Player. So Moon, my man, 100 grand, Louis Armand Player, even still today, I call him my soulmate. He's 5 years older than we are, me and my twin brother. And he, as far as I'm concerned, he is the one that I refer to as my father figure in my life. I know my dad gave what he could to the best of his extent, and Armand was there my entire life. So I honor him in that place as being my father figure. And so he was the type person, his energy is still there. So I'm saying was because I'm not sure how folks are with these different prepositions and things. So I might be using, or past tense versus present tense, I might be using was and is interchangeably, because all of that is true. Well, back to it. Armand is the type man who could take up entire space and not have to say a word, who was loving and gentle and joyous and like play with like kids and play soccer and be silly and do wacky tacky day at school. He was an educator, but he can also have like a deep soulful conversation with an elder about jazz, about the politics of the world. But he is the type person that would just create a space where you just felt safe and affirmed, and you could just be your full and most authentic self, and he just saw you and he just held you in that space. And I was so blessed that I had him for 30 years. And the reason why I have to pause and like speak to him, and I'll go back to him also because he's a critical point in my spiritual journey and this awakening that would lead to Cosmic H.Y.P.E, is that he was the type individual who would just sit and listen without judgment, right? He would tell you, he would ask you like, all right, I mean, you want to know what I think? And one of the things that he'll also follow up with is, you don't have to like it for it to be true. And that's a Louis Armand play original right there. But he was able to do so in a way that I never had to question what his intentions were. There's not ego that was inflated that made him feel like he needed to be overbearing, or to be misogynist, or at that time I was identified as a woman, as a girl. Like misogynoir is not his brand whatsoever, right? He was a loving, protective, caring individual. And the reason why I have to keep honoring him in this space at this point in my life and where I go moving forward is because he was part of the reason why I could move and be so bold into going from this small town to this city. So boom, I'm going into the city. I've moved to DC and I'm teaching and everything else like that. And so I'm still spiritual, but I would say that I was more so on like a Badu tip. I guess you could say, right? Like, you know, the universe and oh my, right? And incense and things like that. But I still needed something. I was anchoring onto something. And so whenever I would go home during breaks, so like I said, I was an educator. So like fall break or summer break or winter break or different things like that, I would go to my brother and sister-in-law's house. Shout out to Sabrina and my niece Sedaria. And of course I would spend time with them and love on them and get loved on. But we would go to Hillside Truth Center that was at the time led by Dr. Barbara King. And I would sit there and I was like, what is this practical Christianity? What is this practical Christianity thing? And so like they introduced me to this thing called New Thought, because the other part of like Christianity that I just couldn't bang with for such a long time is like it felt like such a chasm between what was talked about in church and what people practice in real life. And so with New Thought, with practical Christianity, what ends up what this path is about is that there's a truth that is universal and it's behind all things, right? We call it metaphysics, right? It's the thing behind the physical. And so at the root of this is understanding that all there is spirit, all there is God, all there is universe. When there is no thing, there was love. God is love, universe, spirit. And from that spirit, everything came from. So the very idea of you is from the mind of God. So if it was from the mind of God, of spirit, of the universe, then the very material of everything that could have been made has to be right here within the spirit of God. But again, we're going to talk about it, so I don't want to get too deep into it. And that being said, if we have faith and our faith is put into work and we utilize universal law, then we can actually change experiences in the sort. All that to say, I had a time with my brother and my sister-in-law at this truth center, and things were just a stirring. Something was going on for me. Like I could actually see myself listening and hearing and like, okay, this is starting to make sense, instead of thinking about Jesus and Christianity as like heaven and hell and the sort, but being a follower of Christ, Jesus the Christ, the way, the example of how we can be inclusive and loving, that there's enough for everyone, that there's peace and that there's joy and that there's abundance, and that we can create this reality here on earth. We don't have to wait on heaven. We can make heaven right now. And here was the way that Jesus showed us to do so, and we can make that applicable in our own lives, right? So I was like, oh, okay, this is needed. Wait a minute. So it's not about, all right, let me just kind of keep going to this church and the sort. And so as I started to like actually engage in New Thought, I also started to read Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes. I also read excuse me, this thing called You. It is such a good book. 10 out of 10 will recommend. I'll be coming back to it. Don't you worry. When we think about the art of life, when folks, y'all have already heard a lot of this stuff that I will be talking about, but you know, it's coming through how spirit comes through. But we think about like The Secret or the Four Agreements or the Alchemist. Like there's a lot of metaphysics when you think about that. And we're going to break down a number of those different things for real life application later. But I'm just getting all this information. I'm having all these different experiences, and like there's a stirring up in my soul, right? It's opening up. Like I'm awakening. Right? There's something that's starting to make sense for me. And there's this whole, I'm still queer, but I'm starting to see like there is a space to where I can be whole and holy and completely. And so Armand and I are constantly having these kind of conversations. And every time that I'm there, that, you know, he's affirming me and loving me and everything else like that, I still hadn't come out. This has been, I don't know, I probably moved to DC and been here for like 4 years now, 4 or 5 years by the time I actually brought him in and told him who I was. And so I'll never forget, because I was talking to my sister-in-law. I was like, I don't know. I feel like I need to come out to Armand, because they were actually going to New York, coming down to DC to get to Georgia. So they were like swooping back down. I was like, oh, we want to stay with you. It's like, hey, my roommate's not my roommate, so 1-bedroom apartment. What are we going to do with this, right? And so when I talked to Sabrina, she's like, your brother loves you. It's not going to change or anything else like that. And so finally I built up the courage and things like that. And I called him. I was like, hey, you know, big brother, I got to tell you something. And so I was like, well, you know, this person is not my roommate. They're my partner. And his response was like, I mean, okay. Are they a good person? I was like, yeah, you know, I love them and everything else like that. And he was like, all right, girl. Then, girl, ain't nothing changed since 1984. I was like, really? He was like, yeah, what's that supposed to do with us? Like, I love you. That I don't care who you with or what you do. I love you. And I was like, okay. And I started to get all emotional and stuff like that. And then he was like, have you ever had a chai latte? When I come down to DC, can you take me to go get a chai latte? And that was just it. Like the second person that I was most concerned about coming out to being my brother was like, yeah, nothing's changing. Can we go get some chai latte? And the thing about it is like his acceptance and love, like it wasn't a situation in which he was like, oh, and Christianity and all this other stuff, because he was already on his own spiritual journey and the sort. And so when he not only demonstrated that he wasn't tolerant of me, he embraced me. He saw me and he loved me, and we could just have open conversations. And now let's keep it super funky, right? He was a black man who grew up in the South and mostly lived in the South. So there's still some things that are kind of deep seated that we had to work on. You know, sometimes you got some words that slide, but he really worked on it. Right? He still had some like prickly points that was like, brother, that's kind of problematic, but he was genuine and loving and really truly tried and worked on it and made effort to change language to follow up with like his beliefs that also believe that if you're a good person, you're loving. I'm gonna love you and I'm a banquet, you know what I mean? Like there's enough for all of us to be here, and you being here isn't a threat to me being here. And that's just who he was off the rip. But like he loved me completely and totally, and just the experience of being with my big brother, my soulmate, my main man, 100 grand. I could talk to him about anything. I could be fully queer and all this other stuff and talk about anything from politics to jazz. And he was my mentor. He was a father figure and all this other stuff. Super close. You knew when one of the other ones visited the other, right? Well, my world got rocked. And I'm sure you could probably hear from like some of the ways that I'm speaking about Moon's his nickname, about Armand, that I use past tense, right? You only use past tense when we talk about people who have transitioned or passed away. So when I say transition, I'm talking about death or someone passing away. I just use the word in the language transitioning because truly he went from this physical realm to being in the spiritual realm and breathing me as I breathe in him. Again, we'll talk about that. And so he was diagnosed with brain cancer. And essentially it was like a 3-year back and forth. Like there are some highs in there, like amazing things that happened for a little bit. But eventually the grade 4 brain cancer did what it does to brain tissue. And so for the last 11 months of his life, I mean, my family did everything. We prayed, we fasted, we meditated, we visioned, we did holistic doctors, we did Western medicine, we did trials, we did everything possible. This man, who is a godsend, loves children, loves family, loves his wife and his child and his people and the children he worked with and the families he worked with. Like, he's just an all-around good person. Like, I don't mean to like put him in a place of an idol, but he kind of was as close to a perfect human being that I could even imagine. Like, if you didn't like Armand, then there was something wrong with you, kind of deal. You know what I mean? Like, if he was too much for you, it's because you probably had some dark stuff that you need to work on, and his light was just too much, right? And so we did everything we could, trusting and believing that all this stuff would work out and this brain cancer would, I don't know, do something miraculous and like no longer be there and he would be restored. And it was like a really gnarly transition, right? It was like, we'll talk about that later. But there was a long time where it was just tearing and praying and tearing. It's like, I know what God can do, right? Expecting a miracle, so on and so forth. And so for me, I think that within my family and where I was, like, my prayers started to change from, God, please heal him, to like, Spirit, just give me the peace to deal with this and navigate this, because this is, and I told God, I was like, if you let him die, I don't know what this is going to do to us. So I had just come back, you know what I mean, to being spiritual and in touch and everything else like that. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do if you do this. And continually, I just came back to the prayer of, give me peace to prepare for this so I could be here and present for other people, right? And so everything happened and he ended up transitioning, right? He passed away at 35. And I was heartbroken. And there was a time where I was just sad and depressed, and I could not make sense of any of this that God had done. I couldn't, not at all, right? And so I got to this point where it was like, either the scriptures were a lie, God doesn't care, or my understanding is completely off. Because I couldn't make sense of this, right? And I still don't have the answers. But the last one, my understanding must be completely off, was a thing that released me from a lot of stuff, right? And so and there are so many different things that were given to me during this time that I'll also unpack a little bit later. But when all of this was happening with Armand and he transitioned, there were so many gifts and blessings that were given to me. And the biggest thing is that even with the sharp, jarring pain of losing, the physical losing of my brother, just the physical, just the shell, is that I had a clear and accurate and unquestionable example of God is love. His life and how he loved me fully, how he honored and saw me fully, completely, showed me and demonstrated to me that dissonance that I felt before, in which like Christianity and the things that I was taught, and like the condemnation, particularly of like the queer community and the trans community, things like that, that wasn't God. It wasn't the clear an undeniable example of the scripture, God is love, but I had it, right? I experienced it. I had it for 30 years. And when I was coming into my own, there was God. God's love, God being embodied in our relationship. And so it was with this relationship with my brother, it was with this love that we share. And it was with this transition also that I could keenly understand that I am so abundantly loved by Spirit. That Spirit had created this being that is me from itself. And that I'm loved so completely. And that my light is one that was brought here for a specific reason and time. I know this because I saw my brother's example. That his light was here for a specific reason and time. And so with that, with that, I was just given this beautiful and expansive invitation to surrender all the things that I thought God was and is, to be open to a Spirit that is loving, that is supportive, in which the relationship doesn't start in a deficit, in which I could be fully expressed, that feels expansive, that a relationship with Spirit in which I can fall back and trust, that I can be completely authentic and not feel judged or that I'll be condemned, that I can evolve and grow and be uniquely expressed, because it just makes sense to me that we're all completely different individuals and have different kinds of lives and stuff. Even if we're to look at the foliage in the world, if you think about all the different types of plants, you mean to tell me there's only one way to God? I mean, you can believe that, but okay, whatever. We'll talk about that. But all that to say is that I know that that relationship that with my brother, this relationship that I have with him, was part of a massive understanding and shift to where I am now, to where I can confidently say, I'm queer and I'm holy. I am loved. I am love. I could be all these different things, all in one place, because I'm here on this earth at this time to be fully expressed for a specific reason, for my soul commission. And I'm going to do that because God is right here too. God doesn't end with me. God doesn't end with who I love, because God is love. So if I'm loving you, if I'm loving myself, if I'm loving my partners, if I'm loving humanity, then I'm being about God's love, being about God's work. And there's room for all of us there. There's an invitation for all of us there. There's affirmation for all of us there. There's enough resources for all of us there in that place. And more than anything, getting to that place was critical for me, because even though I've faced so much stuff, I mean, dang, we've all been living here for the past 5-something years, that even when there's a tempest in a tea kettle experience, that means that there's a terrible storm in a small place. You can imagine the pressure. Even if there's a whole lot going on in the world, what I know for a fact, because I've experienced it, is that God is love, and love, agape love, unconditional love, perfect love. I've experienced that. And that I know that if I know better, I can do better. And I have a litmus test. And even if there are folks out there who feel like they haven't had that experience of just having very affirming, not wanting to take anything, only want you to be filled and loved and nurtured and supported and hyped and held accountable when you're dragging, or like to support our dreams and the sort, then I believe a lot of times in our lives, when we see there's an absence of something and we can name it, it's oftentimes because it's our invitation to be it. So if you feel like there's not someone in your life who is being unconditional love and showing you that God is love and is affirming you, then maybe you're supposed to be it for yourself. You're definitely supposed to be it for yourself first. Maybe you have community members that you can rely on to reflect that back to you, which is also why it's also important, I think, for us to ensure that we have people around us who can reflect and affirm that we're whole, that we're holy, that we're worthy of love and expression and freedom and expansion. We need those kind of people with us, right? And so the power of those relationships, I think, and it's embodied in my experience, at least with my own brother, is that those are the individuals who will also give you invitation to take up space with them, right? And to be affirmed by them, and to share with them, and to grow with them, and evolve with them, and to have the grace and the compassion and love to allow each other to do that in life-affirming ways. And so how I got to queer, whole, and holy was not the most, it wasn't an easy experience. A lot of times it wasn't gentle, and it wasn't soft, but I was always cared. I was always carried. I was always held. I was always supported. And I can see it now in hindsight. And I bless the time. And I bless the lessons that I got in that. And so all that, I'm not even quite sure how to even end that one, quite honestly. Hopefully that serves somebody. Hopefully, I'm trusting that it did. I'm trusting this conversation serves somebody. And please know, all of this is just given from a place of compassion and love, with grace. And I ask that you would take what serves you and leave what doesn't, but do so with compassion and love. And if no one has told you, please know that you are whole, you are holy, and you are worthy. Right on to the right on. It's been your Cosmic H.Y.P.E moment. Hype means have your perspective elevated. Peace, y'all.